All right, why don't we get started? Welcome to the 24th Annual Ethics Week. For those of you who don't know, my name is Brian Levy. I'm a teaching professor here in the Mendoza College of Business. I have responsibility for Ethics Week along with a team of others, and the MVP of that team this week is my colleague, Brett Beasley. Among other things, he is the Associate Director of the Notre Dame Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership. But in particular today, he is our resident Zoom expert. So Brett, what do folks need to know about Zoom?
Thanks, Brian. And thanks everybody for joining us. I think that the main thing to know is the best way to interact with our speaker today is going to be through the Q&A function. So everybody should see that at any point today that you have a question, go ahead and put it in that Q&A. And I know Brian is going to be taking a close look at that and facilitating the Q&A at the end. We also wanted to mention that we are recording, so that will be available. Stay tuned for that on the Ethics Week website. And then we also wanted to mention, in addition, we do expect there to be an ND alert at 12:30. So you may hear some kind of noise from that. Keep that in mind, and we'll try to just roll with that when that happens. Back to you, Brian.
All right, thanks, Brett. And thanks to our sponsors, the Mendoza College of Business, the Notre Dame Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership, and Chase Bank. Our theme for the week is beginning with empathy, listening and learning from others. So the team of folks responsible for Ethics Week, we met back last summer, and we considered a variety of different topics. If you turn the calendar back, you'll recall it was a time when we're all in the wake of the death of George Floyd. And so there were racial tensions. We had a contentious political season, presidential election. We were seeing the disparate impact of COVID on certain segments of our population. And then we came to realize that the thing that cut across all these issues was empathy, or perhaps more accurately, the lack of empathy. And so a theme was born. And that gets us to today's speaker, who in his teaching and his research and his work with corporations emphasizes empathy. He is Chris Atkins, an associate teaching professor in the Management and Organization Department here in Mendoza. And up until recently, he was the executive director of the Notre Dame Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership, but he's undertaken a new challenge. So I'm going to invite Chris to join us here and tell us about his new opportunity within the college, and then dive in on his presentation. So take it away, Chris.
Excellent. Thanks, Brian. And thank you all for making time on this Tuesday afternoon. It is a snowy one here in Indiana. I'm actually calling in from just over the Michigan border here. And I hope all of you are well and safe and healthy wherever you may be. We're very excited to launch Ethics Week this time around with this theme of empathy. I'm particularly excited because empathy is the core theme of my research. I came into the field of empathy after really hitting a brick wall in my study of philosophy. I love philosophy. I love philosophical debate. But I realized that so much of being able to really connect with someone, even in a debate where you're arguing one position or the other, is it begins with understanding. Do I really understand that other person's point of view? And I noticed that a lot of conversations, even amongst philosophers who are trained in conversations of different points of view, they break down because we often haven't taken the time to truly stand under the other person's argument, point of view, or experience. And then I started to think about this going, well, this is just every day. This isn't just conversations in seminars or coffee shops around the existence of God or whatever the philosophical conversation of the day might be. But as we move into a world, we already have been in a world where we see and feel polarization around contentious issues. How might empathy be an important beginning foundation that we need just to have these everyday conversations, let alone at a time when we are socially isolated and we might feel more distant, not just physically distant, but maybe even feeling it more difficult to feel understood or to be able to understand someone else. So the theme of empathy for Ethics Week is really as a foundational skill. And I want to say something before we move any further, that empathy is not absolutely necessary to make an ethical decision. So this is Ethics Week. you could, if we use the definition of empathy as simply understanding someone else, you could come to an ethical decision without understanding the person you're trying to influence, the other people that might be affected. You may come to an ethical decision without empathizing with all of the stakeholders. That is, yep.
Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We have here a special guest, Ken Milani, who everyone will recognize, the father of Ethics Week, and he's experienced a little bit of a technical issue. There's no sound apparently on his Zoom, so I'm going to ask, I guess, call an audible here. Can we have some folks on the Q&A perhaps type in and see if they've got sound as well? Or ask perhaps Brett to check the dials there.
Okay, great. It looks like people are commenting that they do have sound.
So they do have sound. So Ken, why don't you, do you want to just have a seat here and stay with us? All right. What a nice treat to have Ken with us. So maybe something on his end. So Chris, my apologies for interrupting there. But just wanted to see if Ken was alone in that issue. So take it away. My apologies.
No problem. Ken, so good to see you over Brian's shoulder. I knew it was you as you came into the screen. For those of you that are part of Mendoza, that Cubs mask and that sweater, give it away immediately, even if you can only see a corner of it. So great to see you, Ken. And you know, Brian likes the company. He cleaned up his office just for your visit today. He was sharing. So fantastic. So this idea of empathy, and I'll move right into the session today. It seems to be something that we obviously can use in academic settings to be able to understand each other, as well as in our everyday lives. And if we think about empathy as simply understanding, or as I've titled my session today, standing under another experience, how difficult that is. Even for the folks who have known us for years and years and years, our parents, our partners, how difficult it can be to understand where someone else is coming from. The exciting thing, and one of the reasons that I started to study empathy, is that empathy is being researched from a variety of different disciplines. And one of the ones that I got particularly excited about was the field of neuroscience. So I'm going to share some of that research with you today, as well as some practical strategies of how we can get better at empathy. And I hope you leave today with something that you can do this afternoon, later this week, that will help you better understand someone else, and maybe even get better at kind of sending signals so others find it easier to empathize with you, because it goes both ways. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And if I could just make sure, if you cannot see the screen at this point, please send us a note in the chat. The other thing I'll mention is that if you have any questions today, feel free to go ahead and share those. And Brett and Brian and now Ken will be able to facilitate those questions throughout the session. We'll have time at the end as well. But seeing the screen okay, gentlemen?
Looks good.
All right, fantastic. So we'll push forward here. So I thought I would share 3 ideas with you today. First is, let's talk about empathy as understanding, and particularly, what are we understanding? The social brain. So this is going to be foundations in empathy. And we want to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what empathy is, because in my experience, people often get empathy confused with sympathy and compassion. And the science of empathy can help us kind of differentiate those 3 different concepts, as well as give us a clearer approach of how to get better at it. The second thing we want to talk about is why empathy matters as a core leadership skill. It doesn't get you everything, but it is at the core of so many important leadership processes, competencies, skills. And that's something that we want to focus on today. And then lastly, can I give you some everyday strategies that, particularly in this time of challenge, that'll make you better in personal life and professional life. And I didn't mention this earlier when Brian, you mentioned that I'm stepping into a new role. I am going to be helping Mendoza in our areas around leadership development. And so this idea of empathy as a core leadership skill will be one of those core things that we'll be building into our educational programs here at Mendoza. And I can happy to share more on that later, but let's just dive in to our conversation today. So I'm introducing this idea of empathy to you. You're probably familiar with that. I want to make sure that we connect it in the context of the neuroscience, and particularly this concept of the social brain. So some of you may have heard about this idea of the social brain. I'd like to share some of that science with you today. Now, this is an image I use in many of my presentations, because while we are social creatures and we have this evolutionary connection to our primates, we have this new technology, our phones right here, and it's so much of what captures our attention, right? So this is a tool. Technology is simply a tool, right? So what do we use it for? Well, I think this device right here and how we use it tells us a lot about our social brain. So we want to begin with this idea of empathy for Ethics Week. But when we think about empathy, we can think about empathy as it beginning with attention. What do we pay attention to? And of course, as soon as you probably are coming out of the session, you may even already be looking at this device already during this session. As my students come out of one of my lectures, what's the first thing they're going to pay attention to? This phone. Now, what does the word attention mean? It comes from the Latin attendere, which means literally to stretch toward. So tendere is to stretch, and the at in front means toward. So when we think about what do we stretch toward, we grab this phone. And then once we pick up this phone, we have choices to make. And those choices tell us a lot about what we value, what matters to us. And so what are we going to go to? Often social apps. We want to know, has someone reached out to us with a message, whether that's our messages or emails? Do we go to an app like Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat? Something that is about social connectivity. This is not surprising because our brains as human beings, that prefrontal cortex has evolved, yes, to do complex problem solving, but also for complex social communication. And that social brain that is woven so much through this significantly evolved brain really is about, does anyone see or connect with me? And that's why this is what we pay attention to. Empathy is about how we find those connections and how we get really good at paying attention to the signals that other people are sending. And also, can I get good at sending signals so that people understand me better? So we are wired as human beings to kind of look for human faces. I may be one of the strange ones on this call, but I look at a plug on a wall, I'll see two eyes and a nose, or I might look at a sink and the two knobs of the sink will look like eyes and the spout coming out will look like a nose. This idea that we're wired to see faces, that's something that's evolved so we can identify and look for someone and say, should I approach or avoid this person? Or are they friend or foe? And of course, advertisers know that we love human faces. And this is a magazine rack that I took back years ago, but we used to fly places and this would be at the airport. But if you just take a quick look, almost as an anthropologist and looking at, okay, if these magazines have been designed to make sure that you stretch toward their particular cover, what's on the cover? Human faces, probably more than anything else. We are looking for that sort of social connection. And that's another example of the social brain. Now, what happens in our social brain as well is that it's very easily aggravated or aroused when threat occurs. And so we can think about anxiety, whether that's the uncertainty of, do I feel safe? I'm afraid that something's under threat. And so this is something we process at a very primal level, but then has significant challenges for us in terms of our everyday social activity. And what's the opposite of anxiety is when we feel safe, when we feel that we're tended and befriended. And so again, we have this kind of evolutionary wiring to look for social safety in the midst of a lot of chaos and threat. And we have definitely been experiencing that over this last year. So with that in mind, let's talk about the social brain and the signals that we can work on getting better at sending, but also receiving and interpreting. So I'm going to share with you a short video on the social brain that comes from the neuroscience of Matthew Lieberman at UCLA.
Humans are social beings that thrive when working in groups. Throughout history, we have enhanced our chances of survival by collectively sharing things such as resources, knowledge, and workloads. Alternatively, isolation or rejection from a group could have decreased our survival chances. As a result, our brain is highly aware of our ongoing social status and possible threats or rewards to this. Today, the workplace is one of the biggest social environments the brain experiences. Our brain is constantly providing us with feedback on our social interactions with others. We need to know when things are working in our favor or when our social situation may be under threat. Our brain interprets our social interactions through the use of neural pathways and chemical messages commonly used for pleasure and pain. For example, when our brain recognizes potential rewards from a social interaction, it releases chemicals along the same neural pathways associated with pleasure, making us feel physically good. When we feel threatened, rejected, or taken advantage of, the same pathways that tell us we are in physical pain are activated. Our brains don't always operate in isolation to one another. We often trigger a threat or reward response to the people around us. We may not even realize we are doing this. So the next time you interact with someone at work, consider what social messages you may be sending and the impact you may be having on their brain.
That video on the social brain comes from the work of Matthew Lieberman. He's considered one of the early pioneers in a field called social cognitive neuroscience. So the cognitive neuroscience of our social interactions. And one of their most significant findings, and I hope you caught it there in the video, was that when we experience social pain, like rejection or exclusion, it activates almost identical pathways to physical pain. And vice versa, or on the other side, when we experience social acceptance, appreciation, or inclusion, feeling part of a group, validated, recognized, it activates similar neural pathways as physical pleasure. All of this to highlight that so much of what we're processing every day isn't just what we experience through our five senses. Yes, our brains are very, very good at navigating our physical environment, but we're also navigating a social environment. And particularly, any of you that has who has raised teenagers, right? I have three, and my youngest is a 7th grader. We see obviously at like 6th grade, 7th grade, usually right around 11, 12, 13, as they get into that pre-adolescence and early adolescence, that social awareness, that social sensitivity comes online. And that's because that period of brain development is second only to infancy in terms of the brain's new development. And in particular, what's growing? The ability to read signals from other people. Then, of course, do I develop that just social awareness, but self-awareness, and this ability to signal back and forth? Now, we can connect this work of Matthew Lieberman on social cognitive neuroscience and the social brain and signaling to an idea that had been around prior to that from the social psychologist Albert Bandura, one of the most significant social psychologists of the 20th century. And this idea of social learning, I don't mean learning through social media, but so many things that we learn through observing and modeling their behavior. Now, from an ethics perspective, not a new idea. We might see this back in Aristotle, and the idea that if we want to get good at virtue, we should watch virtuous people and follow and emulate those behaviors. And now today, we know in behavioral ethics, we've got research to highlight how, ethical behavior at work can elevate the people around you, but unethical behavior at work can pull people down. So we know that the signals we send are activating responses in other people. The line from the brief video you just saw is that our brains don't act in isolation from each other. This is both good and bad news. What this means is for leaders, right, the signals you send can elevate your people or it can pull them down. So this is why leadership matters and leading with values and ethics matters. So where does empathy fit into this? Empathy fits in at getting really good at understanding the signals of others so that you know where they're coming from. And even better, when you signal that I understand someone, they feel valued and appreciated, and they get that safety that they're actually willing to trust you. So trust is an outcome. I work with organizations all the time thinking about trust. And when we think about trust, we know we want it. How do you get there? Empathy is this core move for building trust. I call empathy a core muscle. So if we think about getting good at something, like if I'm going to get stronger physically, having a strong core, like my abs, would be essential. It doesn't get me everything, but it allows me to do all these other physical moves in the gym much easier, better, right? So when we think about empathy as a core leadership skill, this is this idea that we're going to dive deeper into in just a minute. But just quickly, empathy is at the core of building trust, being able to communicate, understanding, did anyone understand what I was just saying, right? So can I understand my audience? When I'm trying to solve a problem, do I look at not just solving the problem, but who has the problem? Empathy is going to be a core piece in innovation and creativity and product and service design, as highlighted in design thinking, which I'll mention in a minute. Empathy is at the core of the workshops I do around diversity and inclusion, because very often we don't understand out-group. We only focus on understanding in-group. And then empathy can be a key skill in ethical leadership for understanding multiple stakeholders, for being able to motivate others. For example, I have 3 boys, and what motivates them is a bit different. So I need to understand what makes them tick in order to be able to kind of help motivate them. And then, of course, for leading change. So often those who want to change a situation or change others, change an organization, when I see change break down, it's often an empathy failure because they haven't understood or stood under the experience of those who they're trying to change or those who may need to change. So empathy, fortunately for us, is something that it seems, at least right now, we'll see what the research and the technology designers will build for us, but it seems to be a distinctively human skill, much like storytelling, right? And so this ability to understand other creatures, right, seems to be something that's difficult for the AI to do. Not to say it's impossible, but it's one of our most deeply human abilities. And this is highlighted by the work of Jeff Colvin. Thomas Friedman highlights that the jobs of the future will be STEMpathy jobs, where we take kind of that science, technology, engineering, and math and combine it with empathy, where in some sense you have that technical side, but also that kind of human side. I mentioned a minute ago that empathy is essential in the design process. This comes from the Stanford D School, one of the founders in the space of design thinking. And the idea here is that the first step in designing a new product or service is to empathize with who has a need or who has a problem. This is called human-centered design as well from IDEO. They call empathic design as thinking from the perspective of your users and doing everything you can to feel and understand what they are experiencing. I want to focus on this definition for just a second. So if we want to get better at empathy, and that's our core theme for this session and for Ethics Week, are we doing everything we can to feel and understand what another is experiencing? Well, now let's go back to attention. I would say that many of us every day are trying to do everything we can to feel and understand, but it's only for some people and not for others. So when we get to this back, the third section of this session today, we want to talk about extending our empathy. One of the things I share again and again when talking about empathy, whether it's with my undergrads or with executives at Notre Dame or even with organizations, is that the good news is that we're wired to be empathic and we can do everything to feel and understand, but we often don't do it all the time. We don't do it with everyone. We have biases or blind spots that keep us from extending our empathy. And that's where we want to move. Now, empathy is not just great for building those connections at home. This is actually the cover from the 2015 magazine of the 50 most innovative companies. And it's not Apple on the cover, it's Warby Parker, the eyeglass people. And one of the ways that they became so successful in growing their business was by means of empathy. And they empathized with the eyeglass wearer, and they empathized on 2 points. One was the pain point of wearing eyeglasses is first the cost. And then what's another pain point? The shopping experience. So they lowered the cost, okay, kept great fashion, but wanted to make it easy for people to buy their eyeglasses. And so they developed this kind of try on at home where you could try on the eyeglasses with your friends, with all your different clothes you may want to wear, as opposed to walking in and the glasses are behind the counter and you don't know what you're wearing, what you should wear for that one time to try on those new eyeglasses. And it was a revolution for them in terms of kind of rethinking the eyeglass experience. And of course, people not only fell in love with their glasses, but with the company. And they also talked about this pay it forward approach. Empathy's also been considered one of the secret strategies, so to speak, the skills that Satya Nadella has been doing to change the culture at Microsoft. Having done some work with Microsoft over the last couple of years, one of the things that I heard is that the old culture was we needed to be the smartest people in the room. Now they want to be the best learners in the room. So that's a different mindset. This is really about, can I understand my customers and clients as opposed to I already know what you need, customer or client. So with that, let's move into this second idea around empathy as a core skill of leadership. But before I move forward, I just want to check in with Brett and Brian, see how we're doing on any technical issues or if there's any questions that I should address at this point, either from you all or that you've seen come through.
Everything looks good.
Yeah, looks good from my point of view. I don't see any open questions here. Maybe, and I don't want to take you off script too much here, but I'm so impressed that you sort of had this insight around empathy. And could you just take us back to that moment when you sort of first saw empathy as sort of the key to your research and your thinking about these issues? Because in all candor, I'm not proud of this, but empathy was a vocabulary word we studied in high school and little else. So I'm again not proud of that, but I'm so impressed that you picked up on this being sort of the central building block to your work. Really across all these disciplines, everything from neuroscience to sociology to philosophy to ethics.
Sure. So I'll say a couple quick things, Brian. I heard this phrase recently. Many of you may have already heard it, at least the professors in the room, that they say that very often your research is really me-search, right? You're researching something that either you want to get better at or that you want yourself. For myself, I often, as a young kid growing up as the oldest in my family, I mean, I had an awesome family, very supportive parents, but I also felt very misunderstood. Like I was into philosophy as a high school student and nobody else was, right? And so I was into all this esoteric music and nobody else was. And I felt very alone. And I also felt very misunderstood quite a bit at the time. And I didn't realize that was kind of a core need that I had until much later when I was working in my master's degree in philosophy. And as I was watching so many different debates happen in class and watching these incredibly smart people still struggle to maybe change their minds or take on different points of view, I started to see that very often we were skipping the step of trying to understand someone else's argument, as I shared in the beginning. But I will tell you, the moment, Brian, was when I was doing my graduate work in education, which was really looking at how could we get better at developing values-driven leaders, right? So what does the science tell us about how do we learn that skill? You start to realize that the approach of just teaching people how to reason, it's necessary, right? Philosophical reasoning, ethical reasoning, it's necessary, but it's not enough. And it was that emotional side, and the work of Joshua Green, who's now the head of the moral cognition lab at Harvard University, had been doing these trolley experiments. Many people are familiar with the trolley experiments of, are you going to shove the stranger off in order to save the 5 people? And his research was highlighting how significant emotions were. So I said, okay, so we've got to not just have like the thinking or the rational side, we have to have the emotions. And I said, someone's probably thought of this before. Because whenever I'm doing research, I'm always like, if I think I have a new idea, chances are somebody's done it already. And I came across the work of Martin Hoffman, and he has an incredible book that was way ahead of its time called Empathy and Moral Development. Okay. And he was the first person who really talked about how you needed to have moral principles, but combine that with empathy in order to kind of be effective in terms of taking moral action, not just understanding a situation, but acting. So it was a bit of a longer answer, Brian, but you and I can dive deeper another time, but hopefully that helped people kind of think about as your own journey, especially if we have some students on here, when you have these questions, you look for other people who might have had the same questions. And often that's where you say, okay, this is a path that I want to dive into. And then basically from there, I was excited to find that there was so much research going on in empathy in neuroscience, but that very few practitioners, business schools and say in businesses had seen any of that research.
So
any follow-up questions to that? Or?
Yeah, no, good, excellent here. So I have one comment at the risk of folks thinking I'm showing a lack of empathy because I'm not wearing a mask. Ken assures me he's been vaccinated twice, so we're good here. And again, we're going to take it on a little bit of a tangent. He's written me a note. How does the wearing of masks hinder or help people empathize with others? You had all this wonderful sort of neuroscience, social science, and now we're all sort of masked up. Thoughts about that?
I've been thinking about that quite a bit, both for having been an educator for 20 years. I really try to pay very close attention, right, and zoom and stretch towards the facial reactions of my students. And the best I can do now is read eyes and eyebrows. Right. And the eyebrows are very revealing, as the Muppets have taught us over the years. But, you're missing all this important emotional facial data. And I think that's hard. And I've had to try to come up with other ways to kind of pay attention to other sensory cues like auditory, like voice tone, things like that. But of course, not everyone's speaking all the time. I also have been trying to empathize how hard that must be for our students. So as an instructor, I'm trying to read comprehension. Should I, what I just say, was it confusing? But they also may want to share an idea, but they can't read what their peers might be reacting. And in a lot of my classes, particularly over this last year, it wasn't just about processing what was going on in terms of COVID. It was about responding to these serious issues and affronts to around racism and systemic racism. And these are issues that many of us have not had experience talking about, and they are emotional, as they well should be. And so how do we signal with our own faces, but knowing that people can't see our facial signals? And then also, how do we maybe can't see someone else's? I think what it begins for me is always about assume best intent. For me, it's been so challenging that I'm missing all of this data, that in the absence of it, the brain can sometimes say worst case scenario, worst possible intent. I need to assume best possible intent. And then the other thing I've tried to do is, this is where Zoom comes in, to set up sessions with my students in small groups or one-on-ones where I actually can see their face.
Yeah.
So and there are certain exercises that I'll do on Zoom, because while 2D is usually not as good as 3D, but 2D with a face is better than 3D without a face sometimes.
Sure, yeah, you can see a smile. So good answers. All right, we took you down a little bit of a tangent, so let's let you dive back in.
Well, and I think, Brian, it was a great question, because each of us in these interactions where we are masked up, it is from a good place of wanting both to protect ourselves and protect other people. And that's that motivation of social connection and care. And yet we thrive, many of us as human beings. The people that I know that are most empathic are so good at reading signals, and they just don't get that same signaling. So we have to try harder, and it's exhausting, So that's another part that we have to, in some sense, practice some self-compassion there in terms of how hard this is in this time. So I highlighted earlier.
I'm going to go on mute here because that's our emergency alert.
Oh, okay, great. So I shared this slide earlier. I just want to go back to it. Empathy as a core muscle, and just remind you, empathy as a core muscle doesn't get you everything, but it does make so many other skills or competencies or behaviors so much easier. So let's dive a bit deeper into how it works. Okay. Brian asked me a minute ago, how did I get into empathy? And I highlighted the work of Martin Hoffman. But I later, as I got into the neuroscience work, and particularly the work of Joseph Ledoux, who did some early work on the emotional brain. And this actually comes from a book he wrote in 2003 called The Synaptic Self. And this is one of those insights from the research that as soon as I found it, I just said, this unlocks so many things for me. Like I use the mental trilogy every day. So let me walk you into what it is and how I use it. So the mental trilogy is Joseph Ledoux's way of organizing how we process in our brains. And one is we think about cognition or our thinking, but we also process emotions or our feelings. And then we also have things like motivation or wanting or desires. And these things are all influencing others. So for example, one of the things that comes up again in the behavioral ethics space, or say in behavioral economics, is something called motivated reasoning, right? Where the brain acts more like a lawyer than a judge. And so our motivations, the outcome we want, right, is actually leading the way. And cognition is there to kind of justify or to build the case, build the arguments, build the reasoning for the what we want. So our motivation. And so we can see here that there's some interaction effects here. Obviously, our emotions shape our motivations. And of course, we've got the work of Danny Kahneman and thinking fast and slow, thinking about the high road, low roads, the system 1, system 2, fast emotional intuition, slower cognitive processes. All of this to say that this is really helpful in understanding human processing. Let me tell you how it connects to empathy. So empathy is, and I've got another slide on this further on, but empathy is not just about understanding someone's feelings. Most people think it's about feelings because it's about pathos, right? It's got that pathos root. But empathy, there's actually 3 types. There's understanding someone's thoughts, that's cognitive empathy. Understanding someone's feelings, that's emotional or affective empathy. And then there's understanding someone's wants or desires, motivational empathy. And you actually use different techniques to get better at each of them. And we often are good at one over the others. So for example, with all my training in philosophy, I was much better at understanding someone's thoughts, cognitive empathy, perspective taking, theory of mind. Those are all the different ways we might talk about it in different disciplines. And yet needed to work on kind of reading the emotional signals. So I think this is what makes empathy so exciting, because it's the simple construct of standing under another's experience. But what are we standing under? Their thoughts, feelings, motivations. And that's why empathy is both confusing and complex, but holds these 3 things together. So what is empathy? We've been using it this whole time with a kind of working definition around understanding. Yes. And I've just added this mental trilogy to it. So understanding thoughts, feelings, and desires. I think when you want to get better at something, it's really helpful to understand how it works. And then ultimately, how do we cultivate empathy in ourselves and others? So it's often helpful to begin with what we call the folk psychology definitions, the everyday understanding. So if you ask somebody, what is empathy? I think people often use this idea of seeing as someone else sees, walking in someone else's shoes. I like this quote from To Kill a Mockingbird. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view. It's like perspective taking. Or, look, this is where we get into standing under, until you climb into his skin and walk around into it. And this is where it becomes very, very challenging. However, I will highlight here that literature and film are one of the primary ways that we can actually step into someone else's world. And we're going to probably see some new approaches. There's ones underway right now and say virtual reality that will allow us to, in some sense, see and experience as someone else. But this is an exercise that of kind of, it's often called dramatic rehearsal, or this kind of empathic throwing oneself into someone's skin, so to speak. Here's another way to think about empathy. some of you may have heard of the concept of Ubuntu. I stumbled into this concept of Ubuntu and connected it to empathy when doing some work with young African leaders. And I think this is really powerful, especially with where we are after 2020. Africans have a thing called Ubuntu. We believe that a person is a person through other persons, that my humanity is caught up, bound up inextricably with yours. When I dehumanize you, I dehumanize myself. The solitary human being is a contradiction in terms. Therefore, you seek to work for the common good because your humanity comes into its own in community, in belonging. Wow. This idea of the deep interconnection that we all have, and that when I lift you up, I lift up myself, and when I tear you down, I tear down others. I think we need more of this thinking in a world where we often look at in-group, out-group, or what we often call tribalism. Obviously, we see that in a polarized, political conversation or other types of contexts. But this is an idea that you see in the African communities around Ubuntu. But in Catholic social teaching, we might think about this as solidarity, right? And empathy is a way, when we extend our empathy beyond our out-group, that we actually can have this deeper interconnectivity. What's exciting about this is as I try to step out of my world and into someone else's world with humility, with curiosity, it actually sparks new insights, and it actually sparks moral motivation. And this is where we want to connect it back to Ethics Week. So my practical definition that I use quite a bit is empathy as seeing and feeling as another. And here's where I'd like to just pause and differentiate empathy from sympathy and compassion. If you take one thing out of the session today, it may be this idea of empathy being different than sympathy and compassion. At least that's what many folks share with me after these empathy workshops. So empathy is clearly about feeling, right? And we talked about empathy being also about, thinking as another person or seeing what another person wants. But we definitely want to keep it in feeling, because empathy has that pathos root, which is right about that kind of intense feeling. We think about pathos with compassion and sympathy. They all have that same root. I highlight empathy with that word seeing, in that our empathy is often activated by what we pay attention to, and that's often visually what we see, right? If we see people in distress, that often activates our sense of empathy. Clearly, empathy is focused on another. So I've highlighted, by the way, the word feeling, seeing, and then another, because it's not about us. There's nothing called self-empathy, right? Right? You can call it self-understanding, but it's not self-empathy. Empathy is directed at others. The word I really want to focus on here is the smallest word, the word as, and that's the preposition. I had a very wise philosophy professor in graduate school that told us to always pay attention to the prepositions, because the prepositions define the relationship between things. And so this is how, with the prepositions, is how I'm going to distinguish empathy from sympathy and compassion. So empathy is seeing and feeling as another. Sympathy is feeling for another, and compassion will be feeling with another. Let me unpack that. So let's say you have a family member who's sick in the hospital. I hope that's not the case, but if it is, you might send a sympathy card. And that means you're sending this signal, go back to signaling, right? You're sending a signal that I feel for you. But it doesn't mean that you might understand or stand under the experience of what it's like to be in the hospital. It just means that I'm concerned about you. And we actually often call sympathy empathic concern. Now, compassion is a stronger move of support. So the sympathy card is great, but if you want to take it to the next level in terms of showing your concern and care, what do? You go sit with the person. So notice I use the word with. Compassion is being with someone, right? We think about that also like as companionship. I'm with you, right? And often compassion's our best move because we cannot always understand what someone else is going through. My mom went through chemotherapy for breast cancer for a year. And I don't know what it was like to have breast cancer, to have any cancer. I've never, I have an empathy gap. And when I have an empathy gap, the best thing I can do is be there for that person. So sitting with her and going with her to chemotherapy as much as I could, at a distance, even when I was traveling, was the best way for me to be able to show concern. Empathy is about, can I understand what you're going through? And this is where empathy, for most of us, does lead to sympathy and compassion, but not always. Because there are some people who are good at understanding other people and then use it to manipulate them. So there are some researchers that say empathy is moral, and many researchers would say empathy is amoral. It's neither moral nor immoral. It's just, it all depends on what outcome you're trying to achieve. So empathy, this idea of seeing as another, it's very much activated kind of in our everyday, looking for the signals of other people. And empathy in the research answers really two questions. This is the one that we often think about with empathy, which is, how does empathy lead me to respond with sensitive and care to the suffering of another person? That's empathic motivation. And then there's empathic understanding. Okay, both are necessary, but I think you get better at responding with sensitivity and care, right, if you slow down and you try to understand what does the other person need. So I mentioned a minute ago that empathy in the mental trilogy highlights that there's 3 different types of empathy. This is just a slide to kind of communicate that empathy is about understanding thoughts, feelings, or motivations. And we want to get better at empathy. Where are my bright spots and where are my blind spots? I mentioned earlier, for me, I have to practice more on the affective empathy, understanding someone else's feelings. And so getting really good at kind of reading those facial clues and cues. And to Brian's point, that lack of emotional data that I'm getting in the face has been a challenge these days. Empathy is typically triggered by 3 things. And this is where we want to recognize the strengths and the blind spots of these triggers. So the first is, we typically feel our empathy automatically activated if the person's right in front of us. So if we can see them, if we can hear them, whether that's in person or on our phones, we typically have a stronger empathy response to those in our family or in our in-group. So for folks on this call, so if something tragic were to happen to someone in the Notre Dame family versus the Ohio State family, we would probably feel a stronger, response to those in the Notre Dame family because they feel part of our in-group. And then we often have our empathy activated when it's an experience that we've gone through ourselves. So typically when I'm teaching undergrads, it wouldn't be unusual for one of my students to experience the loss of a loved one during their college years. And often the students that are able to best support that student in that difficult time are those who have been through the loss of a loved one before, because they kind of have that empathy via past experience. When we think about how empathy works, I'm going to keep this very simple with a great example from the work of Mary Gordon. Mary Gordon developed a program called Roots of Empathy. Mary Gordon's a social entrepreneur and an Ashoka Fellow, part of that organization. And what they do is they bring a young child, usually at about 3 or 4 months, maybe a little older than that, and they bring them into elementary classrooms. They put this green blanket down on the floor. They have the kids kind of come around the side of the blanket, and they get to interact and play with the child. And the parents come in with the child. And the children get to kind of not only interact with the baby, but they get to see how the parents interact with the baby. But they also have a Roots of Empathy teacher, who's this woman in the background here, as you can see, kind of learning over. And she's asking 2 questions to help the students pay attention. She wants them to stretch towards 2 different things. And the first thing she wants them to stretch toward, so no, I'm going back to that word attention. She wants them to pay attention to, what is little James feeling? Okay. So that's affective empathy. That question is designed to focus their attention on the face and get better at picking up the signals of emotion from the face. And then she's asking a second question. So not just what is James feeling, right? Why is James feeling that way? Now that activates cognitive empathy. So it's a really fantastic everyday model of going through this process of first focusing on face, reading the emotions and activating emotional empathy, and then moving to cognitive empathy. And so we often think about empathy as saying, I wonder what that person's going through, but we usually do it in a self-focused way. Maybe not usually, but often we go, how would I feel, or if I were in James's or Isaac's situation? Other focused role-taking is what the Roots of Empathy teachers ask. So how does Isaac or how does James feel? I'm going to skip Lego Luke for today, just for time. But those 2 questions really activate empathy as a zoom lens. So this is some of the language that I use. I think about empathy through this metaphor of a zoom lens. It allows us to zoom in on the face and then zoom out on the situation. So the images that I'm showing you here come from I believe it's a 2012, it's not fully up on my slide here, but I think it's a 2012 article by Jamil Zaki and Kevin Oshner, 2 important researchers in the empathy space. And they were looking at the previous research studies on empathy. And they noticed that there were 5 different regions associated with a certain set of experiments and 5 set of regions associated with another set of experiments. And they're like, okay, which is the empathy network? And they said, there's 2 empathy networks, right? So we have one empathy network, which is called the mirroring system. And those are the green regions that are highlighted here. And these are the ones that help us read the emotions of other people. So when we're focusing on that face, or when we're asking, what does James feel? These are the regions that would be activated to help us mirror, right, the emotions. So we actually see about mirroring, right? If someone's smiling, we get a little brain simulation of what it is to smile. If someone's crying, we feel sad as if they're feeling sad, right? And this is called zooming in my language. So it's when we get up close and personal and we imagine intensely what another person's experiencing. The other network, and this is the blue regions, is called the mentalizing network. And this is cognitive empathy, which helps us understand the thoughts of another person. So this is where we're going to ask that question, why is James feeling that way? Okay. And this is where we zoom out. So typically when we zoom in on the face, we just read the face, but it's often the situational cues that help us understand why someone is feeling a particular way. Now, let me pause here because I know most of you on the call probably don't know the different brain regions, but one of the things that should be exciting here is first, there are 5 regions associated with each, which means empathy is a pretty robust circuit. And there's 2 different circuits, but the circuits are next to each other. So even if we look here in the prefrontal cortex area, the cognitive mentalizing network, the medial prefrontal cortex, is right next to the anterior cingulate cortex, which is where the emotions are, which means when we try to get better at empathy, we can move back and forth from head to heart, from understanding thoughts to understanding feelings or vice versa. So no matter where you start, no matter where your default setting is, like if you're really good at emotional empathy, you can move to that other network, right? Or vice versa, you can move from the thinking to understanding the emotions. How do you do that? Well, for many of us, if you're really good at mirroring people's emotions, it can be pretty intense because now you're experiencing that other person's emotions. So we need to kind of cool down that hot emotion. How do we do that? We zoom out and we try to activate the mentalizing network with that question of why, right? Now, for some of us who might be a little cooler in our initial processing, we're really good at kind of the mentalizing why someone's going through something. Maybe what we need to get good at is zooming in on that face and mirroring, right? So that's kind of this way we zoom in and out. Now, I've got some practical strategies to share in just a minute, but before we do that, we do need to recognize that empathy has some challenges, one of which I just mentioned, which is that it can be over aroused. As I try to understand or stand under your experience, it can be so intense that I can no longer pay attention to you because I have to deal with my own distress. So we call this empathic distress. And so we need to, in some sense, manage that distress. This is particularly true for those who work in crisis types of situations. So we work on this with people who are like in the medical profession or other sorts of emergency crisis situations. You may remember a couple slides ago, I showed you where empathy is naturally triggered right in front of us for those who are in our in-group, our family, friends, and those with past experiences. Well, those are bright spots and automatic triggers. Those are often our biases because it's easy to empathize with those in front of us. It's easy to empathize with those in our in-group. It's easy to empathize with those who've had a past experience. Where do we need to extend our empathy and go beyond our bias? Is that we have to look beyond what's right in front of us. We have to look beyond our in-group and extend it to the out-group. And we need to look beyond our current experiences and try to empathize with those who've had different experiences than us. So with that kind of sets us up to understand we can do empathy, but we can get better at it. So how do we get better at it? And the best way I think to think about this, and I'm borrowing some language from my colleague Ann Tenbrunsel, who's done work in the behavioral ethics space around blind spots, we can think about our empathy blind spots. Who do I miss? Who do I not pay attention to? Who's in my out group? Who has experiences that I've not had? And therefore I often forget to think about them. But then we can think about who are my empathy bright spots. And so we don't want to lose our bright spots, but we want to extend that brightness to those that we might be missing. So with that, I'm going to pause, see if there's any questions before I go into this last round of some everyday empathy strategies to share with you, the things that you can take with you today. You probably hopefully have a couple of ideas, but I'll give you some concrete practices as we can wrap up in our last 10 to 12 minutes here.
So Chris, yeah, thank you, and I appreciate that you're mindful of time and the schedule. I don't see anything in the Q&A. I will say just selfishly, and I've said this to you before, and it's such a treat. You were the first person really that I heard talk about sort of the interconnectedness of neuroscience and sociology and anthropology and ethics and philosophy, and it's just a treat. Every time I listen to you, I've learned so much. So I hope others are enjoying it as well. And the obvious question I had was, so give us some tools we can use, some strategies, and that's really a segue to the next part of your presentation here.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Brian. Well, the good news about empathy, and I highlighted this earlier, is that we kind of are wired as human beings to want that social connection. And it actually feels good when we do it, right? When we try to understand someone and they're feeling like we're trying to understand them, there's like this bond, this connection that happens. And it's really this social connectivity that we often thrive on. And I think that probably we're hungry for right now. And we miss a little bit without being able to get the facial signals that we used to. So it's always good to begin when you're trying to work on something to say, here's what I already do well. And how do I build on what I already do well? So I like working on empathy with students or with business professionals because I know they can do it. It's just, can they do it better? Which category might they need to work on? Emotional, cognitive, motivational, understanding thoughts, feelings, desires. And maybe it's about extending their empathy. I think that's true for all of us. And so I think one of the first places to begin is, let's go back to this idea of what you stretch toward, right? So I call this an attention inventory, looking for your bright spots and blind spots. Who has your attention and what are you taking in every day? So there is so much going on in the world, and we make choices about what we're going to take in, what news channels we're going to listen to, what things we're going to look at in our feed. And of course, the social media folks, even the news folks, they're kind of looking at what we click on, and then they're giving probably more of it. So of course, there's that danger of being in that echo chamber, right? Where our media feed looks more like a Spotify feed, right? We're just getting more of what we tend to agree with or most of what we're interested in. So this is where we have to work really hard, actually, to stretch our attention beyond easy, beyond what we agree with. The researcher Adam Grant, who's a very well-known organizational psychologist, has a new book out called Think Again. And I think one of the core ideas here is that it's great to be wrong. And we should get good at being wrong and wanting to feel like embrace the situation of like having somebody challenge us. And so he talks about the idea of not just having a network that supports us, but do we have people in our network that challenge us? So here are some questions that I just highlighted here. What media am I looking at? What stories? Who are the people that I surround myself with? And do they actually challenge me? Do they push me to expose me to new points of view? The second one is go back to those two questions I mentioned a minute ago. Let's look at your empathy bright spots and blind spots. And let me give you a technique for looking at that. So we can use something called I think I have a typo here. It's not the empathy wheel, but it's called the diversity wheel. So if you've ever looked at some of the research in diversity and inclusion, we often can think about the way we define diversity is in these different categories. At the center of the wheel is the ones that we often talk about, whether it's about gender or race or ethnicity or sexual orientation or age or physical abilities. But around the outside of the wheel, there are other ways that we exclude or include people. Like we often feel more connected to someone when we find out that they also have kids, or they're also married, or they have the same faith, or they were in the military before, or they've had the same job in the past, or they even look like us. So there's all these different bright spots that happen naturally. They're not necessarily wrong, but they're potential blind spots because we gravitate, the brain does like easy much of the time. So who do I find easy to understand? These are the people that I tend to spend time with, the people I tend to mentor at work, the people I tend to reach out to for social connection. But who are those people that are in my blind spot, the people that I find difficult to understand? And you can use this wheel to kind of think about, even look at your own relationships and network and be like, wow, I have a lot of people in these categories and very few in this other category. So how can I kind of reach towards or stretch toward people that might be different? So who are you missing? Who could you get to know better? I love this quote from Abraham Lincoln. I don't like that person. I should get to know them better, because it's just so counterintuitive. Very often the person that drives us crazy, we want to avoid, as opposed to the person that drives to be crazy. How does that make me go, I should get curious about that person. I should spend time with that person. So even when I work with executives on empathy, we talk about the people that they tend to avoid, the people that are the opposite of their preferred work style. And instead of, in some sense, avoiding or excluding that person, how do you make more of an effort to get to know them? And I'm going to skip this slide for now. And this is where we talk into this practical strategy of what I call building a visible empathy bridge. So the key words here are visible and bridge. So bridge might feel like there's a distance or a gap between us. And this is somebody you tend to avoid, ignore, or overlook. How can I send a visible signal? So go back to that social brain video. Is there some way that maybe I have consciously or non-consciously been signaling that at the very least, I'm snubbing them, I'm not paying attention, I don't even know much about them? And can I flip the script, that everyday signaling, and be like, I'm going to send a very visible signal, like inviting them out to coffee or to go for a walk, or asking for their perspective, getting their feedback on a project I'm working on. Knowing that they might have some expertise that would be helpful. Ask them to be a part of your support network or your challenge network. And people are often pleasantly surprised when they get those types of invitations. And it's kind of surprising in that people go, this person typically doesn't reach out to me. They might be a little suspicious, but if you're authentic and you do it consistently, then people kind of warm up to that kind of signal of like, oh, wow, this person values me, appreciates me, wants to get to know me. And then this is a type of social learning where if we've been sending negative signals, we can flip the signals the other way. And this is, again, needs to be something visible that they can see and that we can see. And when they respond positively to it, it gives us a signal back that's also positive. The last one, and you've probably heard about this quite a bit, because this idea of psychological safety has gotten a lot of press, both in the research and in practice. I believe it was Google that when they looked at their high-performing teams, found that psychological safety was the characteristic that distinguished high performance. And this is just this idea that in a team or group of people, where people feel that it's safe to voice concerns or to take a risk or to voice an idea, they feel safe. Because often we say something, we can feel like there's some sort of social signal back that says, okay, that's not the norm, that's not accepted, you're in the minority. How can people, in some sense, take a risk, knowing they could be wrong, but at least put that idea out there and feel that they're actually held or caught? And that, back to that idea I showed you earlier with the primates, that their identity, their ideas were respected and made to feel safe. It's a great article, simple article in the Harvard Business Review a few years ago on just high-performing teams creating psychological safety and some practices of how to create it. Also, the Notre Dame Deloitte Center has some great resources on all of these ideas around empathy and psychological safety. With that, I want to just wrap it up and see if there's any particular questions about these particular categories, see if there's any Q&A. And for those of you at Mendoza, in particular, if you'd like to reach out and dive deeper into any of these themes, I'd be happy to set up a time to chat. And everybody on the session today, hope there's some alums or others out there, love feedback and love to get to know you better. So with that, Brian, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And you've been exhibiting wonderful empathy in so many ways here, especially with respect to everyone's time. Very quickly, we have two questions here. One, you touched on in a sense, how can one be empathetic but not get overly involved, live through someone else's experience? So you talk about sort of those frontline healthcare workers that get sort of over aroused. Any strategy there?
Yes. So often when we want to, when we think about empathy, it's often getting up close, that's zooming in. When you feel that it's too intense, this is when you, in some sense, the simplest way to think about it is I need to get some safe distance. Okay. Now, one of the ways we often do that as human beings is by talking about this with someone else, because it's through conversation that we start to process situations together. There's also other techniques like reappraisal in the neuroscience, where we actually cool down hot emotions by thinking about things not in first person, but in third person, right? So I describe situations almost as an outside observer, as opposed to intensely myself. And I think the last piece is to be understanding with yourself, knowing that when you take on someone else's experience, we have to be careful that we don't automatically assume that it is our responsibility to solve everything for them. We want to support them, we want to help them, but we can't always be the person. We may not even have the expertise to be the person to support them.
Okay, and then last question here. So Katie Price writes, as a leader, how do we connect and empathize with individuals who are guarded and who emit only a few or no obvious emotional signals? It's hard. Sometimes folks, they're a little bit inscrutable, and it's hard to pick up on the social cues, or there are no social cues or signals.
Right. So this is first, I would say, the consistency of being interested and curious about that person, I think is hugely important. I'm looking at research now that highlights how curiosity, right, is the essential move here as it relates to understanding. It makes sense, right? If I'm curious, I want to know so much more. And when you send that signal to someone over time, I think it can, in some sense, hopefully in a good way, wear them down. The other thing I would say too is to be really good at curiosity, it's about designing great questions. And so in my class, we do something called the Empathy Project, where we get really good at designing animating questions. The word animate from the Latin comes from animus, which is is about soul or life. And so those questions where you see somebody's soul, where you see them come alive, and these questions, by the way, are usually asking them about important stories in their past, really, really quite powerful, even when someone is reserved or might have, some signaling that's a little bit more distant.
Okay, good. Well, that's a good segue to tomorrow's session. So thanks so much to you and to Brett and everyone who's participated today. If you are even more curious about empathy, you can join Jessica McManus-Warnell and a panel of students tomorrow who will talk about empathy and racial justice. One of the many sort of aspects of empathy that we talked about last summer when we first started down this road. So Chris, always a pleasure. Again, I don't want to embarrass you, but I always learn so much when I listen to you, and I hope everybody else did as well. I guess a little, we can't, you won't really hear it, but I hope everyone gives you a little virtual private round of applause where they are. Great job. Brett, anything else we need to know, or we'll just leave it there, and folks can join you and Jessica at 5 o'clock tomorrow.
Yep, that sounds great.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody, and great to have Ken, founder of Ethics Week, with us today too. So very awesome to have him in the
special surprise guest.
Couldn't been more perfect. So thanks for listening, everybody, and thanks Brian for all your hard work, and Brett for making this happen today. And good luck to all my future, the future sessions of my colleagues who are offering great panels.